Well, welcome this morning. We do want to invite everybody to join us for the picnic afterwards. We talk a lot about loving God, loving each other, and loving the world, and that's kind of the middle piece. This is like an intentional place where we want to connect with each other, where we want to build relationships with people we might not otherwise hang out with. So come on, have some food, and spend some time getting to know some people after the service. Couple of announcements. A big congratulations to Dano and Charlotte on the birth of their daughter, Rosalie Eleonora Sanchez. I knew I was going to get it wrong. Rosalie Eleonora Sanchez. They are not here, believe it or not. They will be with their newborn probably for a number of weeks. Anyway, congratulations to Dano and Charlotte. And then also over here, Michael and Hannah, this is their last Sunday as single people. They're getting married this weekend. They won't be here next weekend, so congratulations to Michael and Hannah who will be getting married on Saturday. So that's great. Well, for those of you who are regular members of Coast, you know that I've been out for 4 months on a sabbatical, and I want to just start with a couple of thanks. I really want to thank our staff so much for the work they did to make it possible. Everybody had extra work in some way, to Jamie Reichling and Jason Tom and Sarah and Patrick and Joe and Jenny Pace. I'm just really grateful for everybody who stepped up and did extra work. So thanks a lot to our staff. They certainly deserve applause. And then special thanks to Michelle, who did a lot extra for all 4 months. And, there's different, I think, seasons of marriage where, at least I've been so deeply grateful just for a spouse who cares for me. And she just not only did the extra work, but every day was doing things to sort of help me be on sabbatical and not be in the Coast world. And so I really appreciate just her sort of daily protection of my space and time. And so big thanks to Michelle. She's not in here, but anyway, thanks to her. And it's really great to be back. It's great to see everybody. I missed worship a lot. I had this whole plan written up. I told the board I was going to connect with one church in town, try to visit some churches. I had a plan for how to stay spiritually connected while I'm on a sabbatical and away from church for 4 months. And I went a couple times to different churches. And like many pastors, I have a disease where I just evaluate everything. And I went to a church service and heard a message, and I would do that differently and that differently and that differently. And then Monday I woke up, man, I would really have done that differently. And then I thought, I'm just sick in the head. I cannot get out of this. I'm just completely caught in this evaluation trap. So I emailed a friend, what do you do during sabbatical? He's like, I had the same problem. I went to church just a couple times, called my spiritual director, and my spiritual director said, don't you dare go to church on your sabbatical, and don't go again. And I was like, what? Don't go to church? What will I do? Anyway, for some of you, that would be normal. For me, that would be like a really big change. And so I was like, okay, I'll try not connecting. And it was very relieving and restful to just step away from the whole rhythm of spirituality that I've been in for 25 years. But it left me really hungry. And being back last week and worshiping with you, I realized what a joy and a gift it is to worship together. And so I'm really grateful to be back. And what a joy it is to see everybody and just reconnect with a sense of community and the relationships that are here that I care about so much. So I just really appreciate the space that I had during those times. I want to, this morning, sort of do a reflection on my sabbatical. I'll spend a few weeks kind of reflecting on the things I feel like the Spirit poured into me over 4 months, because I feel full in some ways. But I also hope that this is not just going to be about some time off for reflection that I had, but I hope it's applicable to your lives and to all of us. This morning's message is called The Art and Science of Losing to God, and you'll understand that in a little bit. If you have a Bible, you could open to Genesis 32. That's where we're going to be this morning. I want to start with probably the first and last yoga illustration I will ever share. If you've been paying attention, you will notice there have never been yoga illustrations from me, and I don't think there will be after this, so you can enjoy it. One of the things I've been doing on sabbatical, and even before that, is and this is Frank Ueda's fault. If he's in the room, he's not in the room, but this is specifically his fault. My oldest son and I have been training for a triathlon, and we've been doing lots of crazy things training for the triathlon. And one of the things I've found over the course of this training is that I get less and less flexible. Like, as I get older, that's happening anyway. And then we go for like a long run and a long bike, and then I cannot move the next day. Even if I want to, and then if we do something else, and then I can even move less. I'm going to become paralyzed doing this. How do you do this? So I asked some friends, oh, you should try yoga. One point I was at just a regular checkup at my doctor. He's like, yeah, are you stretching? I'm like, I'm trying to stretch, but I cannot stretch. That's the problem. And he's like, well, how about yoga? I was like, I've never wanted, no. Ask someone else, oh, you should try yoga. Finally, our gym had this kind of thing like yoga for people who weren't flexible. It's hot yoga, will help you be flexible. Well, one of the reasons I've avoided yoga is because the first commandment is really important to me, which, says, I'm the Lord your God who led you out of Egypt. Don't have any other gods before me. I was like, I do not want to cross. That's just, whenever I read that, it's like thunder in my soul. Like, that's serious. So I asked our gym manager, hey, how spiritual is this yoga class? And he kind of looked at me a little odd, like, it's probably not the question he gets all the time. He said, well, it's as spiritual as you want it to be. Which is, I think, a perfect answer for today's day and age, right? If you want, you just have the spiritual dial. It's not real. It's just an internal preference. Wherever you want that dial, you just set the dial. You're fine. And he knows I'm a pastor, and I'm like, well, is there spirituality in the yoga? What do they do? He's like, it's just stretching, it's postures, it's for strengthening and flexibility, it'd probably be good for you. So I'm like, okay, I'll go to a hot yoga class. So with fear and trembling, I show up, and probably half of you go to these things, but everybody else has their mat, they have their yoga gear. I show up just in my gym clothes, gym dude, like, which one of these things doesn't belong? So I feel like I'm in middle school, the room's like 300 degrees. No one told me that hot yoga is 300 degrees. It's hotter than it is today. So they do some warm-up stretching, and then the instructor leading it says, just grab your left ankle and pull it up to your thigh. I'm like, well, I can't grab my left ankle. That's why I'm here. It says for flexibility. If I was flexible, I wouldn't need to be here, but I can't grab my ankle. Even sitting down, we're supposed to be standing up, and so I'm like trying to grab my left ankle. Everybody else just grabs their left ankle. They're standing there straight up. And I can see people sort of glancing sideways at me. What's that guy doing? I'm trying to reach my left ankle. I cannot do it. And so she says, well, if you need to use the wall for support, and clearly no one else needs that, so I can tell she's giving a general instruction, but it's like, if you're the middle-aged man in back with no flexibility at all, you can lean on the wall, and that will help you out. So I lean on the wall. I'm trying to grab my ankle. I still can't pull it up. So she walks back to me, which feels good, and she comes over and grabs my ankle. And she just like yanks it up like all the way to my thigh in a position I cannot do naturally. And so she's like, okay, we're just going to hold this for a couple of minutes. And all of a sudden, my whole, my quad, everything starts to cramp violently. And it's really hot. And I start just hosing sweat everybody else is calmly. This is the very beginning of the class. I'm starting to spasm, and I realize I cannot move. I'm actually I can't move, I'm shaking, and I realize if I let go of the wall, I'm gonna fall over. And if I don't let go of the wall, I cannot dislodge my foot from where she put it. And so I'm thinking 911. I'm having, has anyone died doing this? I'm in serious trouble. Finally, my leg comes loose, and I have just horrible pain. I don't know if you ever had a seriously cramped muscle, but my left leg hurt for a couple days after it was such a violent cramp, and I actually left about 15 minutes in the class. I was I can't do this. It's a terrible experience. So that's my recommendation. It wasn't the first commandment that really turned out to be the problem with that yoga class. It was like the heat and the stretching. Well, now here's my strange comparison. I think very often prayer is advertised as relaxing, restorative. It will be the best thing for you. If you're not a regular prayer, you may talk to Christians who advertise prayer like it is the panacea, it's the cure-all. If you spend time with God, you're just going to feel better, you'll feel restful. And honestly, going into my sabbatical, I thought, this is going to be the best thing ever. It's 4 months with God. I'm going to be like a superhero when I'm done with this. This will be great. What could be better? Let's just think a few, just real briefly, if this works, and perhaps it won't. Still have the same tech problems as I did before the sabbatical. A few popular pictures of prayer. So this is the way prayer, I think, is often advertised, right? Prayer is often advertised as a place of refreshing, isn't it? You've heard that, right? Probably even if you don't hang around churches very often, prayer is something that refreshes us. And I think that's often true, incidentally. I'm not saying this is like just false advertising. I think prayer is often wonderfully refreshing. There's all kinds of images in the Bible, all kinds of records in the Bible of the ways that prayer refreshes us. It's often compared to things like a deer drinking from a pool of water. And if we were to just do a survey in this room and say, describe a time that you were refreshed by prayer, I bet that an easy majority of the room would be able to describe a time when prayer was deeply refreshing. Okay, second picture, prayer is often advertised as a place of peace. Many of you know I love Psalm 23. When I thought about the sabbatical and 4 months with God, I thought, lying down in a green pasture, I'm just going to be like the lamb. I'm going to lie down. I'm just going to eat and eat and eat and eat God's word. I'm going to be spiritually filled up. I'm going to be at peace. If the function of refreshing prayer is to kind of restore us and fill us up, I think the function of prayer as a place of peace is to calm us down when we're stressed out, isn't it? Very often, prayer is sort of put forward as an answer. When you are stressed, go to God and you will calm down. And there's some really good evidence. In fact, there's a survey I'll probably talk about more that just came out about how religious practices are, definitely effective in reducing stress levels in our lives. But prayer is depicted as a place of peace. When I was going into my sabbatical, I really wanted peace and a sense of stress be gone and rest with God. Psalm 23, here I am. Like I want to go on that ride right now. And then finally, prayer, I think, is especially in today's culture talked about as a place of centering, isn't it? Like when we get disoriented, when the craziness of life causes us to lose focus, prayer is a place when we connect with the living God where we get reoriented. Like here's the really important things in life. Here's the things that matter. Here's what God has called me to. Here is sort of the living God's will for my life. And it clears away all the fuzziness and cloudiness, the competing responsibilities that make it hard to figure out just how to get through a day. Prayer is a place of centering. And again, I want to say that that's very often true. Prayer is very often a place of peace. It's very often a place of centering. But the reality is that sometimes prayer is a lot different. Sometimes encounters with God are much more challenging than that. And so I want to look at this morning with you Genesis 32, I want to look at an encounter that Jacob has with God that I don't know if he would have said afterwards, boy, that was just the most refreshing night of my life. Boy, that was so deeply centering. That was incredibly restful. He has an encounter with God that changes his life, but it's pretty challenging. A little background just before we read the passage. Some of you know that Jacob, as a young man, he has a twin brother named Esau. And as a young man, he sort of deceived his brother and got his birthright. And then some years later, his father is going to give a blessing to his brother Esau because Esau was the firstborn. And Jacob's mom and he sort of conspire and trick Esau out of the firstborn blessing, which is this mysterious and sort of difficult passage to read. But Esau loses his blessing. Now, to put that a little bit in contemporary context, imagine that your parents have a big house, it's worth a lot of money, and their plan is to sell the house. The will says it's going to be sold and all the assets divided, and you and your sibling are both going to get half the assets. And then imagine that your sibling comes in the night, steals the will, changes it so that they get everything, forges the signature, and then puts it back. And then you find out upon their death that your sibling cheated you out of everything. That's like a serious relationship problem, right? And Esau doesn't take it well. Esau actually vows to kill Jacob. So that's a real problem. Jacob flees into a far land. He ends up getting married. He ends up living with the family of his eventually 2 wives. He marries both daughters of this guy named Laban. And then after 20 years there, he says to Laban, I'm ready to go back home. He goes back home, and he's worried that Esau is still going to want to kill him. And so that's where we pick up the passage. Jacob returning home after 20 years away with his brother having vowed to kill him because of a really dastardly thing that Jacob did. Not just because Esau's, a crotchety guy, but because Jacob, sort of stole everything that was rightfully his. So let me just pray, and then we'll read Genesis 32. Lord, as we read this passage, Lord, I ask that you would help us to understand the mystery and the greatness of your love. Lord, I ask that you would give us a deeper experience of your goodness this morning. Yeah. In Jesus' name, amen. And just as we read this, you might be thinking about if you have a relationship that's really broken, probably it's not so broken the other person has vowed to murder you. It may be that broken, but probably not. But the reality is in this room, there's like broken marriages, there's broken friendships, there's relationships with children that are broken, and Jacob's got a profoundly, terribly broken relationship with his brother. Let's read the passage. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Now, a brief pause. Jacob is about to meet Esau, and he's just heard that Esau is coming with 400 men. And when your brother who's vowed to kill you shows up with 400 men, Jacob probably doesn't think that's a gesture of goodwill from Esau. Like, this is the army that's there to end his life. And so when he sends his wife and his possessions on ahead, that's not just because he wants time alone with God. That's because he wants to live, right? He's sending them partly as like an offering to see, maybe Esau will accept some of the possessions as sort of payback for him stealing his father's blessing and his birthright. But Jacob may also be hanging back to see, like, is Esau just going to slaughter them all? Like, should I cross the river? And so you can kind of see the deceitful nature of Jacob. He's kind of willing to, like, I got an idea. I'll send my wife on ahead and see what happens to her. And then depending, maybe I'll go over. So you have this sense of Jacob is not the most morally upstanding guy. He's still cunning. He's definitely got his own priorities first. And then he wrestles with this mysterious man. Jacob was left alone, and he wrestles with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that the hip was wrenched. Okay, now this is the PG-13 version. Most English Bibles we like tame things. It says he touched the sort of soft part of his thigh, And there's several other passages in Genesis where Jacob's children came from his thigh, his descendants came from his thigh. You get the idea. So this is a little bit stronger than that in the original. I'll just leave it there. It's a little stronger. Touched the socket of his hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with human beings and have overcome." So there's kind of a window opening up on who this man is that Jacob's been wrestling with. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It's because I saw God face to face," which is what Peniel means. "And yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the thigh. All right, or near the tendon, rather. As we sort of look over this passage, a key insight that I want us to catch this morning is that encounters with God often feel like a wrestling match. The reality of prayer is it often feels like some kind of crazy wrestling contest. It often feels like grappling, like I've got a hold of God, now God's got a hold of me, or all of a sudden I've just got a hold of the air, like I lunged to grab a hold of God and I missed. And now God's got me in some kind of headlock, which wasn't exactly the lamb lying down in green pastures image that I was going for. And Jacob wrestles all night with God, and he's exhausted, and then the man touches his hip, and he's crippled. And so there's this really different reality. And what I want to suggest to us this morning is sometimes that's what time with God is like. In a lot of ways, when I have been talking to people about my sabbatical, I feel like this is the passage that stood out to me. It was a lot more like wrestling. It was good, but it was challenging. So let's look at this passage a little bit like a wrestling match. I want to sort of briefly describe 3 rounds, because Jacob, there are actually 3 exchanges. There's 3 question-answer pairs here, and I want to think of them sort of like rounds in a wrestling match. It's not that every time we wrestle with God it goes exactly like this, but I think there's something here that we can pretty deeply learn from. Let's look at the first exchange. So they wrestle all night, and then at the end of the night, the man says to Jacob, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." And it's interesting, I think, that God is kind of saying to Jacob, that's remarkable, isn't it? Let me go. Let me go. But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And so you can see Jacob's tenacity, right? This is a guy who, whatever else you want to say about him, he might be cunning, he might be deceiving, he might be prideful, he might be a me first kind of a guy, but he's definitely tenacious and stubborn. He's hanging on to God. And I think very often there's a time in prayer, and a good time in prayer, when it feels like I'm in control, like I'm not letting go of you, God. I am not letting go. I'm not letting go until you bless me. And a lot of times, I think prayer, especially if we care about it, has this tenacity, like I am not letting go. I'm going to keep going. And remember that Jacob, this is not like, God, I just want the smiley face from heaven. Will you just bless me? Sometimes that sounds a little abstract. It's more like, God, my brother's over there with 400 people waiting to kill me. So blessing for Jacob is like really concrete. God, I don't want to be murdered in the next 24 hours by my brother who I stole everything from, right? So Jacob is praying with a purpose. And actually, Jesus invites us to pray with tenacity. Luke 18, the first 8 verses, Jesus tells a parable about a woman who badgers an unjust judge, and she keeps pounding on the door, and the judge says, it's late at night, go away. And she keeps pounding on the door, and he says, go away, and she keeps pounding on the door, and finally says, whatever, there's nothing I can do to get rid of this woman. I'm going to go answer the door and see what she wants. And Jesus says, hey, if even an unjust judge will answer the door, how much more should you pray like that, right? I think of times in our home group when we've had a few times in the last year where a home group member has lost a job, and we've prayed week after week after week. We're not going to stop praying. Like, we're praying for a new job. We've prayed for health problems. We've prayed for addictions, where we're not going to stop praying. Think of a family member recently who had a brain tumor. And the family, we're not going to stop praying. We are going to keep praying and keep praying. That's what we're going to do. We're going to pray with tenacity. And there's an invitation to pray with tenacity. And there's a sense of, I am not giving up no matter what. But then let's move to round 2. Even though Jesus invites us into this, and I hope that we're a community that prays with tenacity. In a month, we're going to have a week of prayer and fasting, and we want to be a community that prays this way, that says, I'm not going to let you go. But let's look at what I'm calling round 2. Then the man asked him, that is, God saying to Jacob, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with human beings and have overcome. Now, the interesting thing is, Jacob wasn't asking for a new name, was he? Right? He's asking for a blessing. Jacob's like, I want a blessing. Probably quite specifically, I want to not be killed by my brother. But the man says, what's your name? Okay, I'm going to change your name. And I can just imagine Jacob saying, was that I didn't ask for a new name. I actually didn't even want a new name. What if I liked my name? And if you pray very much, I've had this experience a lot. God, maybe you're not really a very good listener. I thought you were a good listener, but were you aware that I was praying for something entirely different than that? I wasn't even asking about my name. There was nothing in my mind that even considered that I would want a new name. Why are you even bringing that up, God? That has nothing to do with blessing. Round 2 is that sense of, I am not in control. This prayer thing just took a turn that I was not expecting. I want this, and God just said, oh, great, well, it's going to be over here then. Perfect. Let's go to door number 2, and let's see what's behind there. Oh, new name for you. Great. Very often, prayer takes that turn. In the middle of my sabbatical, I went to Vail in Colorado. I grew up, my dad used to work in a week a month in Vail, and I love it there. Michelle and I got married there. It's a really nostalgic place. It was a place I went to work on writing my dissertation and just being with God and getting away, and really wanted to devote a lot of time to prayer there. So I got up there and I was just seeking God. God, I want to see you pour out your Spirit. Lord, restore me, fill me. I want to see you pour out your Spirit on San Diego. I've been praying for years for this city. One of the things that came up sometimes when I pray really long and hard, one of the images that comes back again and again is the wall between San Diego and Tijuana. And again, I've had a picture of people on both sides of the border taking that down. And of churches on both sides of the border worshiping on the border together. Lord, I want to see you pour out your Spirit in a way that reshapes our understanding of our city. I want to see addiction driven out. I want to be part of that. Do something spectacular. I'm like praying. I'm not going to stop praying. I'm up here on the mountain. God, fill me up. Early in my life, I often thought about, I want to be a revivalist. And kind of like, God, fill me up. Here I am, seeking your face. like restore me. I feel like I want this new sense of you're going to do huge things. And as I wrestled and wrestled, I didn't hear God answering those things. And afterwards I came home to Michelle and I was like, I don't know. I mean, I feel rested. I feel like even my body's calmed down a lot. I feel changes happening, but I don't think God answered the things. I was like hanging on, but I don't feel like God was answering what I was wanting to answer. And there are times in prayer when it just feels like God's not giving me the answer I want to hear. I'm wrestling, but I'm not in control. I'm battling, I'm contending, I'm asking for things, but God's taking this in a whole different direction. And then the third round is this. Jacob says, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And then he blessed him there. And so Jacob receives a blessing, but notice that God doesn't answer Jacob's question. This is the second time, like, "Tell me your name." And the man sort of sidesteps. "Okay, I'll bless you." Wait a minute. Listening problem again, God. I was asking your name. But that isn't what he gets in return. And so round 3 is the assurance of God's goodness. It's not having all our questions answered. There's times we want to know things about God that God just doesn't answer. And in America, that's really hard. Like, we like transparency, don't we? God, full disclosure, what's your name? What are you up to? Why are you doing this? God's like, "Well, I'm going to bless you." Well, that's not what I asked. I want the full operating instructions about how my life in the universe works, because that's what I want. But God sidesteps and blesses him. And so Jacob receives actually the blessing that he's after, but it doesn't come with all the information that he wants. And I think if we pray very long and hard, we will have this experience where God deeply anchors us in his goodness. Maybe you have an issue in your marriage that you have been just wrestling with and praying for. Maybe you have a broken relationship in your family that you have been praying for, like long and hard. Maybe you have an issue at work that you've prayed for, like, God, do something. Maybe there's a health problem of a neighbor or a friend that you've been praying for. And at the end of the day, there always comes an assurance of God's goodness. But not necessarily in the form we were expecting. After my trip to Vail, I went up to an abbey in central, just above Lancaster, to see my spiritual director, a Benedictine monk named Father Francis. And the whole time, I've just been praying, "God, on my sabbatical, I want you to speak to me clearly." And I woke up one morning with a very clear sense from the Lord, "I'm going to speak to you today." I don't know if you've ever had that, like, heads up, "I'm going to speak to you." And I was looking over just the Abbey website, and there's a little link to the Benedictine vows. I clicked on the link, and as soon as I clicked on the link, I felt like the Lord said, "I'm going to speak to you." Well, that's sort of strange. And as I read the vows, I could tell the Lord, like, he was speaking to me deeply out of the Benedictine vows. And so I got to the monastery, and spiritual director asked what I wanted to talk about. He had some questions. We were going to meet every day, basically, for a week. And I said, I'd really like to just talk to you about your vows. And as he started explaining the vows, I had an incredibly powerful sense of the Holy Spirit filling me. And the Benedictine vows, and I'll share more about these over the next 3 weeks actually, are stability, obedience, and daily conversion. And as he talked to me, it was just like the Lord was pouring into me. This is what I'm saying to you. This is the blessing I'm giving you. But it wasn't the one I was aiming at originally, but at the same time, there was this deep sense of being filled by the Lord. And one of my hopes for us as a congregation is that we are a group of people that are totally anchored in a sense of God's goodness. Like the struggles of life come, relationships gets crazy, family gets crazy, work gets crazy, life gets crazy, but way down at the bottom of it, we serve and follow a good, good God. Well, I want to finish by looking at there's two surprising benefits of losing to God. Because I think Jacob probably felt like, I don't know if I won this battle. Like, the man says to him, I'm naming you Israel because you have overcome, but he's going to walk with a limp for the rest of his life. You know, he was wounded and changed in his wrestling match with God. So here they are, two surprising benefits. One is a new identity. New identity. Jacob goes from being called Jacob to being called Israel. He receives in this wrestling match a new identity. Now, he wasn't asking for a new identity, but that's what he got. And the name Jacob, some of you know this, it means one who grabs the heel. It's like usurper or deceiver. And his whole life, he'd been a cunning guy who got by in the world by deceiving other people. And God said, I have a new name for you. Now, in our culture, we love authenticity more than almost anything, right? I want to be me. I want to be who I am. In fact, you know, one of the worst criticisms you can make about somebody is they're inauthentic. Like, what's the worst thing to say than that person's like totally inauthentic? Like, we really, really love authenticity. The problem is that sometimes our identity is part of the problem, right? Sometimes it's our gifts and our strengths that are part of the problem. The way that Jacob has lived and has acquired wealth and has acquired family, that's not part of like God's best future for him. That's actually part of the problem. And sometimes I think God wants to change our identity because there's broken things in our identity. And sometimes better even than being authentic is receiving who the Lord wants you to be. But it can feel like losing, like, wait a minute, you're taking away who I am, God. Jesus says, mysteriously and wonderfully, words that I think all of us need to hear and figure out. If you want to save your life, you must lose your life. And if you try to save your life, you will lose your life. It's like a riddle, right? Like, what did you just say? And yet it's one of the most deeply true things in the whole universe. There's nothing truer than those words from Jesus. If you want to save your life, you need to lose it. But that cuts right against every bit of our culture, every bit of media we're around, every bit of input we get from childhood, from our teachers, is like, if you want to be your best, you have to be the most you, not you have to lose your life. Jesus is really tipping the tables on everything that's bred into us. And God offers Jacob a new identity. You're going to be Israel. And Israel means something like God overcomes, God prevails. It's from the same root, struggle. Like, instead of you as a deceiver, your identity is going to be God prevails, which is, interestingly, you have overcome, so I'm going to name you God overcame you. It's kind of like, wait a minute. Was that a play on, was that a trick there? Because that name doesn't seem like I won the battle. Like, if I overcame, then why is my name God overcame? Which is often, again, how wrestling with God feels. The real blessing is when we are overcome by God. It's like we win by losing in the battle with God. Just kind of crazy, isn't it? There was a guy named Powers Hapgood. He lived in the early part of the century, middle 20th century. He was educated at Harvard. He inherited a lot of money. He inherited a huge factory. He did something really crazy at the time. He gave the factory to his workers. Pretty good model for contemporary CEOs. Just gave his factory to the workers. And then right after World War II, he started protesting with the poor, and he was arrested for protesting labor laws and with the poor, and he was in court before a judge, and the judge said to him, "Mr. Hapgood, you're Harvard educated, you have all kinds of advantages. Why are you living your life the way that you do?" And he said, "Your Honor, because of the Sermon on the Mount." That, I think, is a perfect picture of an identity conversation. You have these fancy degrees. You have wealth. You should be a great middle 20th century capitalist. You could have had a factory. What are you doing? Here is your identity. And Powers Hapgood, in a sense, said to the judge, "Actually, that's not my identity. My identity has been stamped and forged by Jesus," which is so different, and I would argue so much more beautiful than just having an identity from a highly respected institution or in a lot of wealth or whatever. When we deeply wrestle with God, we come away with a new identity. And the second thing we come away with is a new limp. Jacob's hip socket is touched and he never walks the same way again. And when we really wrestle with God, when we really struggle in prayer, I think we end up with a limp. John Wimber, probably the founding leader of the Vineyard anyway, he was the key early leader in our tribe of churches, often said, "Never trust a person who walks without a limp." And it has struck me over the years that's a deeply wise thing. And when we've really wrestled with God, we walk differently. We're marked by it. One of the most profound things my spiritual director said to me when I was talking with him that week I spent at the Abbey was he said, in the first half of our lives we struggle with the devil, and in the second half of our lives we struggle with God. And I just kind of chewed on that, and I've been chewing on it, and I'll probably keep chewing on it for quite a while, and I'm not sure I'm totally ready to concede second half of my life, so I was a little irritated by that. Like, wait a second, I might have, hopefully I'm not quite there, but maybe I am. All these things I'm struggling with, but I thought there is a deep sense in which in my 20s and 30s I could really relate to. I am battling with the devil. I'm battling with these temptations. I'm fighting this. I'm fighting that. I'm lust and addiction and all these things that ran through my life. And there's a big sense now that I am grappling with God. And when you grapple with God, it changes you. And I'm starting to learn to enjoy it. Like, there is actually tremendous blessing in wrestling with God, and in not letting go, and in finding yourself overcome, and in finding yourself pressed again into the goodness of God in a way that you never expected, and in a way that you never would have asked for. And I hope that we as a community press through to places where we learn God's goodness in the ways that God wants us to learn it, not just in the ways we're hoping for. Okay, just in closing, here's sort of the two results. Then he blessed him there. The man blesses Jacob. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It's because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." So Jacob has this face-to-face encounter. And then as we move forward to Genesis 33, the big question is, what's going to happen with the 400-person army that's descending on Jacob? Right? And if you're reading carefully, you realize, okay, that's great. Jacob got blessed, but now there's the issue of Esau and the army. And dawn breaks, and Jacob's wives go forward, and then Jacob crosses the river, and here's what we get in Genesis 33. But Esau ran to meet Jacob, and he embraced him, and he threw his arms around his neck, and he kissed him, and they wept. I think it's just this profoundly beautiful scene of brothers broken apart, redeemed by the living God, where the covenant that holds their family turns out to be greater and deeper than their own failures, that Jacob's failure does not have the last day, that Jacob's pride does not have the last word, that Jacob's cunning schemes don't have the last word, that it's not Jacob's gifts that win the day, it is, in fact, a blessing of God. And Jacob offers Esau after this all his stuff. Here, take all my stuff. And Esau says, I'm doing great, actually. I don't need it. And then Jacob says, I insist because I was the one who wronged you. And Esau says, because you insist, I will take it. And I can only imagine after this encounter what it would have been like to meet Jacob or Esau. Like, how was your week last week? You'll never believe it. I see you're limping. What happened? Well, it turns out I wrestled with God all night. And he touched my hip. And it'll never be the same again. And in the morning, I went expecting that my brother was going to tell his 400 men to slaughter me, and instead he ran up and he threw his arms around me and he kissed me. And I can imagine Esau saying to a friend on returning home, you'll never believe it, I was going to kill my brother, and suddenly I felt favor well up in my heart, and I knew that I could not execute my oath that I had made to slaughter my brother, and instead I made the decision to bless him and to receive him back. I mean, that's like good dinner conversation, right? That's way above average. Like, we praise the Lord who reconciles the things that are more broken than we could ever imagine. Well, this morning we're going to close with a song of worship. Worship team, if you guys want to come up. But a couple things, we just want to pray for anybody. If you have a relationship that seems like hopelessly messed up, after the song of worship, we'd love to just pray for you. If you feel like your relationship with God is hopelessly messed up, we'd love to pray for you. If you feel like you have a family relationship that's really hurting, we'd love to pray. Because the Lord our God is one who meets us and one who wants to really anchor us in his goodness. Let's worship. We really had a sense earlier, there was a team of folks praying for the service, and just had a sense that God wanted to give blessing for some broken relationships, hope for broken relationships, and even reconciliation of broken relationships. If you've got a relationship you would really love to see God do something in, we want to just invite you to come on up. Some of you, that might be a relationship with God. Maybe you're on just a journey spiritually right now, and you have a sense that something is off. We'd love to pray with you. The picture earlier of an anchor, like God's goodness like an anchor, and image that the ship was just blowing back and forth, but the anchor was holding. And ultimately, as followers of Jesus, I think the anchor is the cross. The deepest reality is that Jesus died for us on a cross and rose again. And problems are going to come, and relationships are going to break down, and maybe it's your fault, and maybe it's someone else's fault, and maybe it's a lot of people's fault. But deeper than the storms it's the reality of God's great love poured out for us, shown to us. And so it's a little vulnerable, but if you know, man, I've got a relationship that's broken up right now. I have a sibling who won't talk to me. I have a coworker who is just against me. I have a boss
who's unjust. I have a child who's gone away from the family. I have a mom I cannot deal with. We want to just pray. We want to ask God for hope, for joy even. So if you guys would hold hands across the aisles, we're going to pray. I want to close the service. We do this each week as a reminder that we are a community, and we'll just have a time of prayer up here afterwards. But as we said, we have a picnic outside, and just an invitation. You know, we heard about an amazing God story this morning. We heard about an incredible reconciliation. One thing you could do is meet someone you haven't met before and just ask them, is there something amazing God has done in your life? Like, there are so many crazy God stories in this community. And you look around and sometimes it's awkward to meet someone you haven't met. But you know, one thing I love is finding out the crazy things God has done in other people's lives. And it makes community richer. And it makes our own lives richer. And it gives us faith for things I would never have faith for. I would never have faith for God healing the deaf if I hadn't met a woman whose deaf son was healed. I wouldn't have the faith for God healing a relationship where a divorce had already occurred if one of my good friends hadn't had God speak to the husband and the wife simultaneously to quit running around and to get remarried and to see that God can reconcile anything. Like, even after the water is under the bridge, God can do crazy things. Share some stories out there. Lord, thanks for your goodness. Thanks for your cross, Jesus. Lord, would you pour your love over us this week and help us to shine in this world because of all that you have done in our lives. In your name, Jesus. Amen. God bless you guys. Enjoy the picnic. If you'd like prayer, come on up.